Good morning. What's going on there, folks? Good afternoon to some out there as well. It's the Earthmaster here, back on this Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. It's about 10:50 in the a.m. out here along the west coast in California, where it's reasonably quiet for earthquake activity compared to the rest of the Pacific Plate. Things really ramping up overnight, this morning, and right now along the areas of the Pacific Plate and adjacent plates over here around the Philippines. Latest quake coming in, a 3.1 up in Turkey. We did just have a 6.0 earthquake over around the Philippines. Let's go ahead and check out this activity that's definitely ramping up, specifically around New Zealand and northward, but for now a 6.0, 6.1 actually, coming into the area of the Philippines, north or southeast of Manila. Looks like this earthquake about 20 kilometers deep around the surface levels, not super deep. Of course, we got the Philippine Trench here. We can see some rather deep earthquake movement there in this area of the plate, but for now, a relatively shallow 6.1 coming in within the last hour. Historical data. This area does see quite a bit of earthquake activity as listed here on the map. Definitely within that zone of some major movement. Don't believe there's any type of tsunami statement with this, but we'll just go ahead and double check, make sure. I'm not seeing it. Nothing showing up there from the USGS. As far as the DigiFillet reports, looks like a few folks around the region north here of the epicenter and south reported some light to potentially moderate shaking there in the Philippines. I think the big picture right now is this activity ramping up around New Zealand and the Tonga Trench, Kermadec Trench area. We did see some activity ramping up last night. Now I'm going to show you just the USGS map for now, but the EMSC model shows a lot more activity occurring here around the New Zealand area. Last night we did see a 5.7 kick off here into the area north of Wellington, North Island, New Zealand. Around the Cook Strait area, 74 kilometers deep. And then, well, a little bit later, about 8 hours or so later, early this morning, my time, a 5.0 coming in, 115 kilometers deep for a 5.0. Now, this is kind of a little on the concerning side because we do have a major subduction zone that sits off the east coast here of the North Island, New Zealand. And that's the Hikurangi subduction zone. There's not a whole lot of data out here in terms of when the last full rupture happened along this major subduction zone, but it is possible of seeing a major mega quake out here in this area. Of course, subduction zones extend all the way up north here into the Kermadec Trench and Tonga Trench as well. But this area here hasn't really shown any activity in historical times, so to speak. So there's not a whole lot of data to go off of. There's been obviously some studies on it, and I'll include a video as a up next video here on YouTube to watch when it comes to the potential there for the Hikurangi. Definitely a major area for a large earthquake. An 8-pointer out here along this area of the subduction zone, or potentially higher, would be devastating. All right, so let's check out what's going on down here in New Zealand. There's a whole lot of activity kicking up around North Island here recently, and this comes after some activity down south around South Island, New Zealand area. I'll show you guys here real quick. We have been seeing a little bit of smaller earthquake activity prior to all this movement up north around the Alpine Fault here, South Island, New Zealand area. But as we look at the map here on the EMSC model, we can see a little bit more detailed information here. GeoNet servers here showing that 5.7 earthquake around the Cook Strait area. Let me go back over here. I'm going to close a couple of these here real quick. We don't need that many open. I'm going to get it. And then following that 5.7 this morning, there's quite a few other earthquakes at some variable depths here, including some deeper movement quakes off the east coast of North Island, New Zealand area. 48 minutes ago, a 3.6 coming in to the region of the. This is about at the northern end of the Hikurangi, southern end of the Kermadec Trench here. There's kind of a little line of, you guys can barely see it, maybe right about here is where the Hikurangi subduction zone starts. You can kind of see it on the oceanic crust, and it extends down here south of Wellington, just offshore of the South Island, New Zealand area. And then they got a different name for it, a little bit more prominent subduction zone called the Kermadec Trench up north, where we do see some large earthquakes as well. And then, of course, the Tonga Trench, where there's continued activity right now as we speak. But the Hikurangi is a little bit on the concerning side here for the folks in New Zealand. That's kind of like the Cascadia subduction zone here of the Pacific Northwest in the States. And that's a little concerning to see all the activity around it, and some deeper level quakes here recently taking place. So yeah, we got activity continuing there just on the northern side of the Hikurangi, and on the southern side. Looks like they did have another 5-pointer here about 4 hours ago. Is this going to be ours? Yes, it is. That's going to be that one up north. I'll show you guys here real quick. A little bit of interactive view. This one here, again, striking on the northern end. Go back here to the map. What do we got? How many earthquakes do we have listed up here on the map? 7 listed. But as you can see, quite a bit just this morning time frame. And this goes back over the last couple days as well, listed up here on the map. So we would have to go 48 hours. Yeah, we can go back the last week or so, New Zealand area. And this is just North Island. We did see quite a bit, as mentioned, down south as well. But I'm a little concerned with up north right now with the Hikurangi. Some of these deeper movement quakes, as mentioned, is associated with that Hikurangi subduction zone. We got to watch this and see how it, see if this is going to point towards the Hikurangi. It kind of looks like it is with this deeper movement quake here recently. But overall activity here across the New Zealand area, it's been trying to play catch up here for a little while. Earlier this year, January and December of last year, we had quite a few 6s and 7s up here. And of course, all the westward pressure movement up here around Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu area, all seeing some sizable quakes everywhere except for roughly about the southern end of the Kermadec Trench southward into New Zealand. So it finally looks like, excuse me, things are starting to catch up a little bit here around the plate boundaries. But at the same time, definitely want to be on guard for this monster that sleeps off just off the east coast here. The earthquake activity there in the Cook Strait, New Zealand area last night was definitely felt over a broad area. Quite a few reports coming in from the Wellington area down into the South Island, New Zealand region as well. A glance here at the GeoNet servers. I want to show you guys how many reports were coming in from that earthquake from last night. These guys still have it as a 6.3. Now, you know, this is what their agency is stating, a 6.3 from last night. But USGS 5.7 and the EMSC model showing a 5.7 for that area. But GeoNet reporting a 6.3. Looking at about 60,000 reports from the folks there reporting this earthquake. Anywhere from, well, it looks like extreme, of course, down to the weak level. So this is definitely a strong earthquake. Now, whether it was a 6.3 or not, GeoNet sometimes can be a little on the I don't want to use the word overrated, but they kind of keep their magnitudes a little bit on the elevated side. If I were to look for a 6.3 across the map, I would look for the signature potentially here in Yellowstone. We see 6-pointers show up across the globe in terms of the seismograph stations here. And I Trying to think here if this is going to be the 6.3 or not. I believe this is it here, right around the, let's see what we got here for the UTC time. Looks like about 12:40 or so, right? Let's see when that took place. Roughly there. That's 22:38, but the UTC time over here is going to be, let's see, 06, close to the 40 mark right here. And it looks like, you know, definitely, I'm thinking that's going to be the 6-pointer reading. So it's hard to say, folks, you know, on who's accurate, but the GeoNet server that monitors earthquake activity reporting that as a 6.3 at 50 kilometers deep from last night. So we'll definitely continue to watch that 50 kilometers deep. Since then, these guys noting some other deeper movement a little bit further up north with a couple 2s and a 4.0 as well. Trying to see where that 5-pointer is at. Looks like these guys are reporting that earthquake that came in as a 5-pointer as a 4.7. So a little bit of up and down. A larger magnitude for the earthquake that they're stating, at least the USGS and EMSC is saying smaller. But then again, the USGS is stating that there was a bigger quake up here when the GeoNet is saying it's smaller. So back and forth, who knows? Either way, I think we all can agree definitely an uptick in New Zealand earthquake activity currently taking place. Now the earthquake drums here will definitely show a lot of that activity taking place in the region. This is going back minutes before the current timestamp here, so this ain't going to show the 6.3 or the 5.7 that occurred here in the Cook Strait area, because it's doesn't cover that far back, but this area does. These drums down here do. So there's going to be the 6.3 that was recorded around the Cook Inlet area. Of course, going to show strongest around the region north of Wellington, North Island. But as you can see, it showed up broadly everywhere across South Island as well. Now the smaller quake, the 4.7 or the 5.0, take your pick, would be most noticeable up here, North Island area. And it's definitely there. Seen it more localized, it looks like, around this station here. It's going to be the 4-pointer, 4.7, 5.0, but also followed up here by a couple other smaller earthquakes. Notice these little spikes here, indicative of some earthquake activity as well. Those are going to be some of the 2s taking place out here across North Island. So definitely things ramping up. Let me see if anything's kicked up here across the volcanoes. You know, these are going to show the earthquakes as well, but these are positioned specifically across various volcano areas, monitoring stations that monitor not only the seismic waves but volcanic activity. Doesn't look like anything's been stirred up at any of the volcanoes aside from the localized earthquake activity across New Zealand. But either way, quite a few folks did report feeling that earthquake. We'll continue to watch that as an area of interest right now. Let's go ahead and check out the last sizable earthquake activity out there. Stand by for a second here, see if I can get everything together. I'll go over here to the catalog book. USGS does monitor earthquake activity out here. I kind of like the layout that's listed out here. So we're going to go back to the year 1000, and we're just going to type in sizable earthquake activity. I'm chatting about 7.0 and above. I am going to draw a area over here around New Zealand, and the Hikurangi is a very interesting subduction zone. It's definitely has the potential for some larger earthquake activity. Let's see here. So I pulled up 7.0 and above, basically since the records have been kept here for the USGS. Now the most recent one, now we're not talking about areas north along the Kermadec Trench, because they did have an 8-pointer. 2021 was the year of the 8-pointers. This was just one area that's seen an 8, I think it was an 8.1. So we're not talking about areas way up north into this subduction zone. I'm just specifically looking at areas around the New Zealand area. And the last earthquake looks to be that 7.3 Gisborne area, 10 kilometers deep. Now that's a very shallow earthquake at the surface levels. During in the subduction zone level, you can get some deeper movement quakes and also some very shallow earthquakes taking place around the subduction zone. But far as a full-on eruption, or not eruption, but earthquake here along the Hikurangi, it's not showing it here up on the map because there's a little uncertainty as to when the exact when this last had a full rupture. But looking at historical data, 7.3. Our last larger earthquake down there, 7.8, South Island area, north of the Christchurch area. Definitely a strong earthquake. In fact, these guys had 2 7-pointers back in 2016. But this one here, definitely a good shaker. North of Christchurch area. And then we had some other earthquakes as well. South Island, New Zealand area, some 7-pointers. Outside of Wellington area, we did see a couple 7s as well. The last one specifically within this area looks to be back in 1942. North Island, New Zealand area. A couple older movement quakes here, folks. We're coming up on 100 years since we've had any 7-pointers up here around the Wellington area. So that also could be a little sign of maybe some 7s out there in the future of North Island, New Zealand area. But again, the big thing is that Hikurangi subduction zone. An area here that's lacking some seismic activity here. This is pretty much a seismic gap here along the Alpine Fault. This one is another area that is waiting for some larger activity. Down south here along this plate boundary, we did see a little bit of activity. Looks like back, I want to make sure I'm covering specifically these two along that plate boundary. 2003, a 7.2, and then 1993, a 7-pointer. But that seismic gap hazard exists well across South Island, New Zealand area around that Alpine Fault. Definitely a big player. And it's, look at that. It's a reasonably large section here of the plate boundary that's lacking that large-scale activity. So the potential is definitely there across New Zealand. I guess in any case, when you live along a major plate boundary like that or subduction zone, is to be prepared. Castle Point, I'm not for sure how big this area is. Not for sure about the population density out here across these regions of the eastern coast here. Up into Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, like we have the Cascadia subduction zone up here. Let me show you guys real quick. We have some very large communities along the coast that are within that tsunami hazard zone. Very level surface out here. So the subduction zone of the Cascadia sits offshore here. This one, we know there's a little bit more historical data on this one because there's been quite a few studies, and I've studied it myself. It was back in 1700, and we know there's been some major tsunamis produced here due to the tsunami deposits that were deposited inland, well inland here along the Pacific Northwest, and that was back in 1700. 323 years ago. So this is another, this is my monster sleeping out here. I live here in Northern California. I think it's safe to say I'm safe from a tsunami here in the Sacramento Valley. But the 9.0 predicted shaking will definitely be damaging for the area. And then throw on a tsunami on top of that. That's kind of a little on the scary side. But as always, just got to be prepared. Don't get complacent. That's the key. Don't be don't be complacent out there. If you're out there on the beach, out there along the coast somewhere where you're in a tsunami hazard zone, you feel some strong shaking, don't hesitate. Get to some higher ground. So we will continue to monitor the activity there across New Zealand. Listed up here on the globe, there's a whole bunch of earthquake activity. This is going to show the GeoNet servers, so that's why we do see a 6.3 listed up there. Again, GeoNet reporting a 6.3, and I think it's possible that it could be close to a 6.3 because of that seismic signature I am seeing across the Yellowstone seismograph stations here in Wyoming. So yes, large earthquakes can show up on seismograph stations across the globe, and I like to use Yellowstone because I'm fairly familiar with how they have these tuned, and as far as picking up, certain earthquakes locally, but also at the same time they do pick up the distant earthquakes, the larger ones. So GeoNet server definitely showing a lot of earthquake activity there, as well as EMSC and USGS. Now we're seeing pretty much an unstable area up here along the Kermadec Trench North, New Zealand as well. Since last night, things have gotten very active across the area. One of the more recent quakes, the Tonga Trench occurring up here, or an earthquake along the Tonga Trench, relatively shallow, about 30 kilometers deep for that 5.1. Given the activity continuing across the region here, I think it's safe to say we definitely need to watch for some further regional large-scale activity across this area, and that does include New Zealand. Philippines area, and areas around the adjacent plates here of the Philippine plate. Not showing a whole lot here on the USGS map, but we do see it listed across the EMSC model. Over here, already looks like there's a whole bunch of aftershock activity following that 6.1. Quite a few 4s and some 3s. Movement along the Java Trench. All this activity pointing towards, definitely some large-scale movement about ready to take place here across the Western Pacific. Last night, following that 5.7 or 6.3, take your pick, we did see some almost immediate adjustment up north into the Aleutian Trench here where that 5.2 came in. I got to remember the Pacific plate here, it is a huge plate, and there's always pressure in some areas more than others around that plate boundary and adjacent plates. There's never really a loose plate area. There's always strain and stress. So when we get one area of the plate moving, we can almost see immediately in some areas some plate adjustment, and that's what we've seen up in the Aleutian Trench, and also in Hawaii. We've seen a 4.7 and that 5.2 strike literally within a short time of each other, following that movement down south here in New Zealand. So what that tells me there is we're seeing these regions get hit that haven't been very active recently. New Zealand for one, and up here along this area of the Aleutian Trench hasn't been all that active either. But think about it. There's been more areas that really haven't been seen any larger scale activity. That includes the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench and California, West Coast. Speaking of the West Coast, let's go ahead and check this out here real quick, see what we got. Waiting to see some adjustment over here. Looks like we did see a little bit of activity earlier this morning along our region of a subduction zone, the Cascadia. Had this earthquake coming in 2.2, 18 kilometers deep. Now that is up there, upstream of the tremor. The tremor takes place down underneath this land, underneath Northern California, into the subduction zone, about 45 kilometers deep underneath this area. The further left you go up here on the map, the more shallow it's going to be, up towards the locked area where all this strain builds up, kind of like where the spring is, that winding up of the spring of pressure in this subduction zone. We've seen a 2.2, 18 kilometers deep. A little bit later, minutes later, 3.8. Very shallow earthquake activity here around the southern end of the Gorda Plate. This has been increasingly of concern here lately with the amount of movement here into the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone. You can kind of see that trail of activity stretching basically downward. It's going to be deep under this area, and then more shallower earthquake activity up towards the subduction level where that strain is built up. And also up north here, just off the coast here of Brookings, we're seeing some very shallow earthquake activity at the surface levels here of the Cascadia. And that's definitely an overall sign here of some strain building up. And of course we get this back building here along the plates and the Gorda plate down here. The Cascadia, I've covered this quite a bit, but the Cascadia can have basically two possible scenarios. One would be an entire full rupture of the Cascadia, which would be at least a 9.0, potentially a 9.2. We know the last full rupture was back in 1700. Prior to that, throughout history, there's been partial ruptures, and of course for their full ruptures, but partial ruptures take place when only one segment of the subduction zone ruptures. We've seen that happen more historically along the southern end of the Cascadia, and that can be anywhere from an 8.5 up to an 8.7, which would definitely probably trigger a tsunami out here as well, but more localized here to the southern Oregon and northern California area compared to a complete rupture, which would well, that would be extremely damaging up here across the entire Pacific Northwest and Vancouver Island ranges up here. So, you know, I'm kind of leaning towards more of a, if we're looking at this activity that's been taking place here recently over the past, not only the past month, but over the past couple years, we've seen more tremor activity into Northern California, more earthquake activity into Northern California out here along the southern end of the Cascadia than pretty much anywhere else. But that doesn't mean that a full rupture won't happen. I'm just kind of leaning towards more, I think, of the southern partial rupture of the Cascadia. 323 years is a lot of built-up strain. All right, looking at further activity out here across the Pacific Northwest, a little bit of movement out around the Olympic Mountains, 2.4, 26 kilometers deep. Now that is associated here with the Cascadia as well underneath this area. A little bit of movement across the volcanoes, very small microquake activity, no major adjustments though. California, the rest of California here, getting some activity within the last hour, some microquake activity around the Calaveras Fault and the San Andreas Fault here, and over here around the Long Valley supervolcano. Got one within the caldera, it looks like, a 1.6, 3.5 kilometers deep. Southern California, not showing a whole lot of activity currently. It looks to be the quiet zone, but don't let your guard down. Things can change in the blink of an eye. Throughout the Intermountain West regions, relatively quiet conditions, couple small microquakes across the area. And Yellowstone National Park, supervolcano, has been having a little bit of earthquake activity up there, mainly yesterday. I don't see anything from today, but I do want to check out the most recent data here across the area. There's going to be that 5.7 or 6.3 in New Zealand. As far as earthquake activity goes, there's not a whole lot. Localized seismic activity is going to look something like this that we seen last night over here as well. But as you notice, things have kind of calmed down out here along this area of Yellowstone. The rest of the country, very minimal. Some activity across Oklahoma and Texas. Caribbean Plate, a little bit of activity around the Puerto Rico area once again. Did have a deeper movement quake here this morning around the Columbia area. This is another subduction zone that sits here within this northern end of the South America area. Columbia Trench over here to the west, 161 kilometers deep here. Notice the mountain ranges across the western side here of this plate. That is a major subduction zone. And of course that's where the largest ever recorded earthquake activity took place down here with that 9.5 there in Chile quite a few years back, before I was born. Atlantic Ocean did see some activity yesterday. Nothing kicking up here so far today. Excuse me. Let's see what else we have here across the area. I do want to go to the EMSC model globe here, see if we're missing anything across this area. A little bit further activity in the 3 and 2 range around the South America region than what the USGS is reporting there. I think we better go to Hawaii and see what's going on here. They did have that 4.7 coming in again almost right after that earthquake activity in New Zealand. It looks like it did get upgraded to a 4.8. That was felt pretty much all over the Big Island. Look at the DigiFillet reports there, covering not only the Big Island, but areas over here. Looks like around Honolulu, all the other islands. So this was kind of a, one of the larger quakes that we've seen here in a little while. It's within that swarming area down around the southeastern edge here of the Big Island. Excuse me. I cannot get it out of my system. I don't know if I got a slight cold or what's going on here. It could be the dryness in the air, getting some of that colder air coming down, but dry. So 4.8 Hawaii. I kind of want to see if they put out any notification on this earthquake. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They're at the HVO informational statement. This is going to be it right here. So here they chat about that 4.8 southeast of Pahala, island of Hawaii, at a depth of about 20 miles, which is 32 kilometers below sea level. The earthquake had no apparent impact on either Mauna Loa or Kilauea volcano. Sometimes it can. This earthquake is part of the seismic swarm under the Pahala area, which has been ongoing since 2019. But here, as we mentioned in many of our updates, that the swarm has been potentially ongoing since the 60s. Pretty interesting article if you want to check it out here as to why there's so many earthquakes that take place at around 30 kilometers or so on the southeastern edge of the Big Island. Pretty crazy. Well worth the read. So no damage, felt reports, and again, no adjustments to any of the volcanoes. But I do want to check that out for myself, and just to verify, right? A lot of times we can see these seismograph stations and any effects that it may have done across the area. We're going to check out, see if the seismograph station's working here. Nope. Offline. There you can just barely see the 4.8 right here on the 12-hour map. Got to go to the 24-hour map to see that. It's going to be a pretty large earthquake right there. Doesn't look like there's too much adjustment there across the Kilauea volcano, Pahala area down here. Yeah, not a whole lot going on. Just 4.8 and then return to normal conditions. Mauna Loa up here at the summit looks about the same. That's going to be the 4.8. Past 6 hours here. Local seismic activity a little bit across the Mauna Loa area. You can see one right here. A couple other smaller quakes locally to that region. But yeah, no major changes as the HVO folks put out in that informational statement. Turkey area still continue to be very active out there. Latest looks like a 4.6 there last night, but I know we've had more. Again, the USGS will only put out 4.0 and above. Looking at this region, yeah, quite a few 3s and 2s here overnight as listed up here on the globe. Some further activity up into the Romania area, some 2s and 3s. Looks like the latest earthquake here, some movement around the Mediterranean. But, you know, there's a lot of activity taking place here globally, folks, across the region. Across the world, I should say. Philippines, New Zealand, Tonga, Hawaii, Aleutian Trench, everywhere. But the West Coast, I mean, yes, we had some earthquake activity out here, some deeper movement quakes around the Cascadia. But something I believe something's getting ready to pop out here, so to speak. That's just a lot of movement here in the last 24 hours. Definitely got to watch some quiet zones here, folks. So not only the West Coast, California, right? It's always on my radar, but also areas around the plate boundary that haven't seen any activity here over the past couple days. Over the past few months, yes, we've seen some 6s and even some 7s along this plate boundary, but gosh, it's looking awfully quiet here across the area right now of the Papua New Guinea area at Solomon Islands. So we'll watch a couple of these different zones. Again, broad scale, definitely broad scale uptick activity across the globe currently taking place here. Goodness, it might be a very active day, as it has been already, right? Definitely has been. All right, what do we got down here into South Africa? 3.1 outside of Johannesburg area. That one coming in last night, it looks like. Alrighty, well, just be safe here, folks. Space weather activity has been ramping up as well. But it looks as though, we're toning down a little bit. The solar flux index is going down below 200. That tells me that the energy, the amount of energy that these solar flares or these sunspots are shooting off is going down. These sunspots are obviously still active, but they're looking relatively stable, including this one that I was somewhat hopeful for. So it kind of looks like these things are going to degrade further as they drift across the Earth view, which these are all pretty much currently aligned and directed at Earth, but they're relatively stable. And what's left behind it, not a whole lot. So looks like we're gonna enter into a little quiet spell of activity currently. 10% chance for an X flare, M flare at 50, C flare at 99% chance. And looking at the data overnight, kind of shows us going on that decline downhill, showing the solar flare activity declining. Did have a little bit of a aurora uptick, unexpected. It looks like they added it this morning. G1 conditions there. KP index reaching up above 5, indicating some aurora conditions up at the higher latitudes. Now, it looks like, let's see here, a little article put out by these folks here. Looks like there was a relatively weak CME passage overnight. Another enhancement will be possible February 18th due to a partial halo CME observed leaving the sun very early this morning. This was a result of a small filament eruption in the vicinity of AR 3220 near the center disk. All right, so center disk, Aurora Skywatchers should remain alert during the next several days. No major uptick, but hey, a little bit of interesting aurora potential coming up here. All right, guys, I am going to jump off here. Again, got a bunch of schoolwork I got to catch up on. But we will be monitoring the activity out here as things are ramping up like crazy across the region. We will catch you guys a little bit later on this evening for a complete update. Again, check out this video that I'm going to be posting up here at the end of the video in regards to the Hikurangi subduction zone. I've covered it a little bit more in detail, and quite a few other folks here on the YouTube area have covered that as well. It's well worth the read, well worth the watch of a video. If you live down there in New Zealand, I'm sure a lot of folks know about the dangers that exist out there with not only the Hikurangi, but you got numerous other fault systems, the Alpine Fault, and several others that pose a risk for New Zealand here in the future. We'll catch you guys a little bit later on. Have a good day. Stay safe out there, everyone.